Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the peculiar, unsettling, and often baffling history of how women's anxiety was treated across time. Imagine yourself lying on a thin straw mattress in an ancient stone room, your breath slow and shallow, incense curling in the air like a warning. A bearded man with a scroll and too much confidence approaches. He's not here to help. Not really. He's here to tell you your womb has gotten bored and wandered around your body like a drunk toddler. That's right. Your uterus has gone rogue. You probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes and realize you're not in your room anymore. You're in ancient Egypt, or maybe Greece, it's hard to tell. The architecture's stone, the air is dry, and every other person seems to be holding a scroll or a jar of something pungent. The place smells like honey, sweat, and vague authority. You've just been diagnosed with hysteria, a term derived from the Greek word hystera, meaning womb. Congratulations. You're now officially medically misunderstood. The earliest theories of women's anxiety, though they didn't call it that, were heavily anatomical. According to Hippocrates, the revered ancient Greek physician, women who exhibited mood swings, fatigue, or random crying spells weren't sad or stressed. They had a wandering womb. This mythical uterus apparently drifted around the body like a balloon, causing trouble wherever it went. Chest tightness, uterus near the lungs, headaches, uterus got curious about the skull, stomach pain, uterus vacationing near the intestines. Some scholars still debate whether Hippocrates actually believed this or if he was summarizing a broader medical tradition, but either way, it caught on. And once a bad medical idea catches on, oh boy, does it stick. To treat this rebellious organ, doctors prescribed methods to coax it back into place, like placing sweet-smelling herbs near the vagina to lure it down, or holding foul-smelling substances near the mouth or nose to chase it away from the upper body. You were a human piñata, and your uterus was the candy inside, just floating around, ruining your vibe. You sit on a clay bench while an elderly woman crushes myrrh into a small bowl. She's muttering something about balancing humors. The whole concept of medical treatment here is more vibes than science. But still, she's gentle, and her eyes are kind. You're lucky. It could have been worse. In some cases, if your female troubles didn't resolve quickly enough, you'd be prescribed celibacy, or marriage, or children. The solutions always seem to involve controlling you somehow. There's a strange blend of religion, patriarchy, and pre-scientific curiosity swirling around you. Some physicians think your anxiety stems from divine punishment. Others think it's due to not being pregnant enough. And a few, just a precious few, wonder if maybe, just maybe, you're just tired, overwhelmed, and not being listened to. But they never say that out loud. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the Ebers Papyrus, an ancient medical document from around 1500 BCE, offers its own set of treatments for female disorders. Some involve oils, resins, and fumigations. A popular remedy includes crocodile dung. That's right, crocodile dung. Some historians suggest it was used as a contraceptive, others as a general-purpose cure-all. Either way, your treatment plan just got significantly more disgusting. But let's get real. These early ideas weren't just based on ignorance. They were shaped by deep cultural fears about women's power, sexuality, and unpredictability. A woman who didn't conform, who cried too much, stayed up too late, or dared to speak with passion was a problem that needed fixing. It's both hilarious and horrifying that the idea of a wandering womb persisted for over 1,000 years. Long after Greek society had faded into memory, medieval and Renaissance physicians continued using it as a core explanation for women's emotional instability. This wandering organ became a scapegoat for everything from seizures to melancholy to boredom. One 16th century physician even suggested that the womb could climb as high as the throat, causing choking and shortness of breath. what we now recognize as a panic attack. Modern scholars laugh at this theory now, but they also note something darker. The way ancient medical systems saw the female body not as a human system with emotions and intelligence, but as an unstable, disruptive machine that needed regulation. It wasn't about healing, it was about containment. And here's the kicker. There's still debate over whether the symptoms that ancient physicians attributed to hysteria were even psychological in origin. Some researchers think these women were likely suffering from real physical conditions, epilepsy, endometriosis, thyroid disorders, but lacked any way to be accurately diagnosed. Others argue the problem wasn't the body at all, but the soul-crushing limitations women lived under. If you were married off at 12, forbidden to read, and expected to bear 6 children before 30, who wouldn't have a breakdown? You lie down again, watching the smoke from a nearby lamp swirl in the air. Someone brings you a drink, a bitter tonic made from fermented barley and licorice root. You're told to sip it slowly and think pleasant thoughts. No one asks about your dreams or fears. No one seems interested in what your life feels like from the inside. The problem, they say, isn't life, it's you. And yet, there are moments of kindness here too. A young midwife notices your trembling hands and presses a small cloth into them, soaked in rose oil. "For comfort," she whispers. It's not much, but it's something. Not every healer was a fraud. Some genuinely tried to help in the only ways they knew how. As you drift off, your mind returns to that absurd image. Your uterus floating around like a helium balloon, bumping into organs like it's playing a game of medical pinball. It would be funny if it hadn't caused centuries of real suffering, but this is just the beginning. There's more to come: potions, spells, accusations, surgeries, and scandals. We're only scratching the surface of how badly history misunderstood women's inner lives. And don't worry, we'll come back to that crocodile dung. The air is thick with something herbal, sharp and earthy, like crushed sage, old smoke, and something vaguely sweet that tickles your nose. You're sitting cross-legged on a woven mat in a dim medieval cottage, and the woman in front of you is muttering. Not quite to you, not quite to herself. Her voice sways like a branch in wind, rhythmically repeating syllables you don't recognize. She sprinkles dried herbs onto a burning coal, and the smoke curls upward like it's trying to escape the absurdity of it all. You've got anxiety, though, of course, no one calls it that yet. You're simply nervous or melancholic, or, if we're being especially generous, troubled, and tonight your treatment involves a combination of mugwort, thyme, a cloth pouch sewn with protective runes, and a firm suggestion that you avoid sleeping under the full moon. Because obviously that's what's causing your unrest. In the early medieval period, before science had much of a say, illness, especially in women, was often considered a spiritual disturbance. That meant healers weren't just mixing herbs and bandaging wounds. They were also fighting demons, redirecting curses, and warding off bad luck. Your trembling hands? A sign you've been looked at too long by a jealous neighbor. Your chest tightness? Possibly a fairy sitting on you. The cure? A poultice and a whispered prayer, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in a dialect that only old women in mossy cottages remember. Some historians still argue whether these folk treatments were more superstition than medicine, but others suggest they were a form of prototherapy, rituals that offered comfort in a chaotic world. After all, if no one else listens to your fears, even a chant in the dark feels better than silence. You shift on the mat, the scent of mugwort now strong enough to make your eyes water. The healer presses a warm compress to your neck, murmuring that this will draw out the sad wind. You try not to ask what sad wind means. Honestly, you've learned not to ask too many questions around here. One of the more mainstream beliefs at the time involved the theory of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you had too much black bile, they said, you'd become melancholic, lethargic, despairing. But if you were a woman, the diagnosis escalated quickly. Too much black bile in a uterus? That's not just melancholy. That's a full-on hysteria episode. So in many cases, women like you ended up in the hands of herbalists, mystics, or local cunning folk, since actual physicians were often reserved for wealthy men and royalty. And even if you did make it to a doctor, chances are he'd open a vein and drain your blood to balance your moods, because obviously that'll help. But let's stay here for a moment, in this smoky little cottage. Because while it might seem odd or even silly by modern standards, this world of spells and potions wasn't always malicious. Sometimes it was the only form of care a woman could get. Some remedies were surprisingly effective. Valerian root to calm nerves, chamomile for sleep, lavender to reduce restlessness. The fringe and the folk often knew more than they were given credit for. And still, every herb-laced tea came with strings. For every helpful midwife, there was a priest warning that a woman who knew too much was a danger, and for every successful charm or healing session, there was the lingering risk of being called a witch. Let's not pretend the stakes were small. All it took was one accusation. Maybe you were seen wandering alone at dusk. Maybe your neighbor's cow got sick. Maybe you read too much. Or maybe, just maybe, you cried one too many times and made someone uncomfortable. Suddenly, your mugwort sachet wasn't healing. It was heresy. There's an old account from a 13th century village in what is now Germany. A woman named Gertrude was said to help other women with childbirth pains using herbs, teas, and whispered blessings. She was beloved, until she wasn't. When a nobleman's wife suffered a miscarriage, Gertrude was accused of witchcraft and dragged to the town square. The irony, she may have known more about reproductive health than the town physician. Some scholars argue that what we now recognize as women's anxiety and depression were often treated with suspicion not because they were dangerous, but because they were inconvenient. A woman overwhelmed by her thoughts threatened the illusion of calm. So instead of addressing the root, loneliness, oppression, lack of agency, they diagnosed the woman, and then they burned her. So while you're lying here, wrapped in a scratchy wool blanket, sipping a bitter tea meant to calm your vapors, you're also surrounded by danger. Healing is a political act. Your anxiety isn't a symptom, it's a rebellion. And now, let's talk about the holy water. In many places, especially those under heavy Christian influence, anxious or grieving women were brought to churches rather than healers. There, priests would conduct exorcisms, not always the dramatic head-spinning kind, but gentler rituals meant to cleanse a troubled soul. Holy water was sprinkled, psalms recited, and in some cases the woman was instructed to sleep beneath a consecrated altar cloth. Did it help? Sometimes, ritual, after all, has psychological power, but more often, these ceremonies reinforce the idea that female distress was spiritual failure, not mental struggle. Meanwhile, actual medical texts from this period continued to blame everything on the womb. That wandering uterus just wouldn't take a hint. Some medical writers proposed binding women's bellies with tight cloth to anchor the organ in place. Others suggested applying pressure to the thighs or soaking the feet in vinegar. You wonder how they managed to be this creative and still so unhelpful. But not all was bleak. In some corners of the world, particularly in early Islamic medical traditions, physicians began to explore mental health with more nuance. Thinkers like Avicenna wrote about emotional disturbances with compassion and intellectual rigor. Some even argued that melancholy could affect anyone, regardless of gender. Sadly, much of this knowledge would later be dismissed or ignored in Western Europe during the centuries that followed. Back in your drafty cottage, the ritual is winding down. The healer gives you a small pouch to tie around your neck. Inside are dried herbs, tiny bones, and something that smells like rain. Keep it close, she says. It listens. You nod, unsure if the charm is meant to soothe you or spy on you. Either way, it's yours now. The fire crackles low. You stare at the ceiling, wooden beams stained with time, a spider inching its way across a cobweb like it's got a schedule to keep. And as the scent of sage fades, your mind wanders again. Maybe the herbalist was right. Maybe healing isn't always about fixing. Maybe sometimes it's about being seen, even if just for a moment, even if that moment comes from someone who thinks the moon is eating your dreams. Tomorrow someone might call you bewitched, but tonight you're just tired. And for once, someone noticed. There's a hush over the town square, the kind that feels unnatural, like the world is holding its breath. You stand barefoot on uneven cobblestones, your hands bound, your heart a tight drumbeat against your ribs. People are gathered around, but no one meets your eyes. You've been called a heretic, a witch, a woman out of balance with the natural order. But all you did was weep too loudly, laugh at the wrong moment, or maybe know too much about roots and boiling things. Welcome to the late medieval and early modern witch hunts, where women's mental distress wasn't seen as illness. It was seen as evidence of sorcery, of rebellion, of the devil whispering through a woman's lips, when she dared to speak too boldly or trembled in the night without a man beside her. You look up at the wooden platform where the accused are taken. The rough boards still bear scorch marks, maybe from the last woman, maybe from the one before that. Historians estimate that between the 15th and 18th centuries, tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were executed for witchcraft across Europe and colonial America. Many were midwives, healers, widows, or simply women whose behavior deviated from what men expected. And what counts as deviation? Well, anxiety made the list. If you screamed in your sleep, trembled at shadows, or wandered into a dissociative fugue, you might be said to be possessed. If you withdrew from social life, you might be accused of cursing your neighbors. And if you had convulsions or mood swings, that was practically a signature move of the devil. One mainstream historical fact, the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, provided a theological and procedural guide for identifying, interrogating, and executing witches. It explicitly stated that women were more prone to witchcraft because they were weaker in faith and more impressionable. The book wasn't just a bestseller, it became the de facto manual for inquisitors and magistrates for centuries. So here's the reality check. Anxiety wasn't just ignored, it was punished. And it didn't take much. A sudden scream, a bout of fainting, a miscarriage, a prophetic dream. Maybe a neighbor saw you rocking back and forth near your window. Maybe your own husband thought you were acting strange. Maybe someone heard you talking to yourself, trying to process emotions in the only safe space you had, inside your head. Any of those could mark you as cursed, as dangerous. And because everyone feared the devil, their fear overruled your truth. Some scholars argue that many of the symptoms described in witch trials, convulsions, hallucinations, hysteria, closely resemble what we now understand as trauma responses or neurological conditions like epilepsy. There are even theories that certain outbreaks of witch hysteria were triggered by ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic mold that grows on rye and other grains. Was the devil possessing women, or were they just unknowingly tripping on bad bread? Meanwhile, others point out something even darker, that the witch hunts provided a convenient tool for silencing women who stepped outside the roles society allowed. It's not just that they were accused of curses, it's that they were punished for being complex, emotional, and uncontrollable. You're marched toward a wooden chair, surrounded by judges in robes and hoods. The room smells like damp parchment and burned wax. You're asked absurd questions. Did you fly in the night? Have you lain with demons? Why did the village baker's dog limp after seeing you? There's no way to win. Deny it, and you're accused of lying. Confess, and you're a witch. Some confessions came after hours or days of torture, rack, sleep deprivation, crushing weights. Others came after women simply gave up, realizing no one believed them, or worse, realizing everyone wanted to believe the worst. You can't help but think, is anxiety less terrifying than hope in a world like this? And it wasn't just Europe. The Salem witch trials in 1692, often dramatized in films and literature, followed a similar pattern. Young girls began having fits, twitching, shrieking, collapsing. Local doctors couldn't explain it, so they turned to what they could explain: witchcraft. And the moment they labeled it that way, the panic exploded. 19 people were executed. Most were women. The symptoms: possibly psychological stress, possibly food poisoning, possibly suppressed grief in a rigid Puritan society. One accused woman, Sarah Good, was described as sullen and muttering to herself. In another time, she might have just needed a warm blanket and a therapist. Some historians still debate whether these trials were driven by religious fervor, land disputes, or mass psychogenic illness. A kind of psychological contagion where fear itself becomes the sickness. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Emotionally distressed women were seen as threats to be eliminated. Back in the medieval world, the flames flicker dangerously close. You're told to confess and be forgiven, or don't, and face divine judgment. Either way, your story ends the same, and maybe that's the most heartbreaking part. How many women never got the chance to have their pain seen as human? But not every community was like this. Some small villages and enclaves had protective systems. Older women who shielded the younger ones, families who stood up against accusations. In some cases, clever women managed to turn their roles as healers into forms of quiet power, blending religious imagery with folk knowledge to maintain their standing. Still, even in those places, anxiety wasn't seen for what it was. It was a weakness, a flaw, a signal that something had gone wrong with you, not around you. And for women, that made you a liability. You lie back on a straw mattress, hearing distant whispers of prayer, the creak of wood, the rustle of skirts. You imagine what it would have been like to live with constant fear, not just of the world, but of your own emotions, to flinch when your hands shook, to hide your tears, to pretend to sleep so no one noticed the dread that clung to you like a second skin. One fringe detail: in certain Slavic traditions, women who showed signs of emotional distress were sometimes believed to be touched by forest spirits. This wasn't always considered evil. In some tales, it was a mark of spiritual sensitivity. But still, the woman was usually isolated, her behavior watched carefully. Being different always came at a cost. And what makes this all so cruelly ironic is that many of the women accused of witchcraft were the very ones trying to heal, trying to soothe babies with colic, trying to ease labor pains, trying to brew teas that helped with sleep. They weren't saboteurs. They were survivors. Now, centuries later, we know that anxiety is deeply tied to our nervous system. That trauma lodges itself in the body. That women's experiences aren't mystical failures. They're deeply real, deeply human responses to an often unforgiving world. But back then, you didn't get a diagnosis. You got a trial, or worse, you didn't get one at all. You take a breath, heavy and deep, and try to shake the feeling of smoke from your chest. The scene fades around you, slowly, like a fog lifting. But the weight of it lingers. You weren't cursed. You were overwhelmed. You weren't possessed. You were unheard. But in this version of the story, you're still here. You're still listening, and that means we can keep going. You're lying on a wooden table, cold against your back, with a thin sheet covering you and absolutely no sense of privacy. A man with a sharp nose and sharper tools stands nearby, adjusting a tray of objects that sparkle in the torchlight like tiny, terrifying stars. He's not a torturer, technically. He's a doctor. And he's convinced that your emotional imbalance can be fixed by bloodletting and a few strategically placed leeches. Welcome to the world of medieval and early Renaissance. Parkland medicine, where the humor still reigns supreme, and any emotional distress you feel is believed to be the result of your fluids being all out of whack. Yes, we're back to the four humor theory, because heaven forbid a woman be anxious because of, say, actual problems. The humors were supposed to be in perfect balance for health. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much black bile? That's melancholy. Too much blood? That's passion or hysteria. Or maybe it's Tuesday. The symptoms always sound suspiciously like normal feelings, but somehow they get you diagnosed with a condition that requires medieval plumbing. So now, here you are, your arm extended as the doctor ties a strip of linen around your bicep and taps your skin like he's choosing the ripest fruit. He nods to himself and grabs a knife. Not too large, but large enough to feel very personal. He mutters something about restoring balance and then slices, just enough for the blood to well up, run down your arm and drip into a waiting bowl like you're a human teapot. You're supposed to feel better, relieved, less hysterical, but mostly you feel woozy and very annoyed. And yes, this was real. For centuries, bloodletting was the go-to remedy for everything from headaches to heartbreak. It was believed that excess blood, especially in women, led to irritability, anxiety, and mood swings. By removing a pint or two, doctors thought they were clearing the body of corrupted humors and making space for balance to return. One mainstream historical fact: even into the 19th century, bloodletting remained a dominant medical treatment across Europe and the United States. It wasn't until the late 1800s that doctors began seriously questioning its efficacy, and even then, some held on to it like a favorite superstition. But leeches were the real stars of this chapter. Leeches weren't just for backwoods superstition. They were ordered by actual physicians, carefully applied to areas like the temples, neck, and even the genitals. Yes, you heard that right. In cases where a woman was overly passionate or emotionally unregulated. Imagine having a panic attack and being told, yes, let's pop a few bloodsuckers under your chin. That should clear things right up. Even worse, in many cases, women weren't even allowed to speak about their own symptoms. Husbands, fathers, and brothers described the issue for them. A woman who trembled, wept, or had trouble sleeping wasn't asked what she needed. She was labeled. She's acting out. She's too sensitive. She won't stop worrying. And once the men described the symptoms, the doctors prescribed the cure. And that cure almost never involved listening. Instead, it involved things like purging, forcing women to vomit to release bad energy, or enemas, or cupping, placing heated glass bulbs on the skin to draw out blood. These procedures were physically invasive, often painful, and almost always based on theories we now know were completely, ridiculously wrong. One fringe historical tidbit: in some 17th century medical texts, anxiety was blamed on an imbalance caused by the moon's influence on the female constitution. Yes, Luna herself was dragging your emotions out of whack. Some believed full moons made women more anxious, like a celestial version of blaming Mercury retrograde for missing your bus and crying about it. The truth is, women's bodies were seen as inherently unstable, always teetering on the edge of dysfunction. And so, any emotional behavior, grief, nervousness, or even simple assertiveness was viewed as a sign of illness, not in a let's help her way, but in a let's drain her way. Now, let's talk about a procedure that really took things up a notch: clitoridectomy. In the mid-19th century, some physicians, most notably in Britain, believed that masturbation caused insanity, nervous disorders, and, you guessed it, hysteria. So they removed the clitoris in a horrific attempt to cure the patient. This wasn't fringe medicine. It was practiced by so-called leading doctors and even endorsed in medical journals of the time. Some scholars still debate how widespread this practice was, but even a few documented cases are too many. It's a stark example of how women's bodies were subjected to violence in the name of emotional regulation. And now, perhaps the darkest layer: consent. In many cases, women had no say in these treatments. A husband could authorize a procedure. A father could arrange an admission to a sanatorium. A woman's own testimony was often dismissed as part of the illness. She says she's fine. That's proof she's not. It was a maddening trap, and through it all, the bleeding continued. Some women were bled monthly, others quarterly. Some were kept on regimens of leeches and purges for years. The damage, both physical and psychological, must have been immense. But it was all masked by polite medical terminology. It wasn't abuse. It was therapy. It wasn't neglect. It was treatment. There are letters from the 18th century in which women described feeling faint, exhausted, and hollow after repeated bloodletting. One woman wrote that she could feel my mind drifting like mist off a field. That's not recovery. That's trauma wrapped in linen. But even in this bleak medical landscape, a few voices started to question the norm. In the late 1700s, some doctors began to advocate for non-invasive methods: walking, reading, social interaction. Others observed that the more a woman was listened to, the fewer symptoms she exhibited. Could it be, they whispered, that the problem wasn't in her blood, but in her life? Of course, those ideas were drowned out by louder voices holding blades. You're standing again, dazed, walking away from the apothecary with a bandage on your arm and instructions to come back in a week. You'll feel lighter, he says, as if losing blood is like losing emotional baggage. But you don't feel lighter. You feel cold, diminished, like a candle burned at both ends. And somewhere deep in your gut, this isn't healing. This is erasure. A strange detail sticks in your mind as you walk. There's a belief in some rural European regions that a woman's tears could spoil crops if she cried too much near a field. That her sorrow wasn't just personal, it was contagious. Even nature rejected a woman who felt too deeply. How convenient, but don't worry, things are going to get weirder. Because if draining your blood didn't help your anxiety, maybe lying completely still and not talking to anyone for 6 weeks will do the trick. That's right, we're heading toward the infamous rest cure. Brace yourself, but not too tightly. You might bruise easily after all that blood loss. You wake up in a room that doesn't quite feel like a room, more like a pale, padded memory. The walls are cream-colored blank. The curtains are drawn, thick and heavy, filtering the daylight into something that looks more like fog than sun. There's a bed, there's a chair, there's a pitcher of milk on a side table, and a notebook you're not allowed to write in. Welcome to the 19th century's most famous non-solution to female distress, the rest cure. You're not allowed to read, not allowed to write, not allowed to speak to anyone outside of your physician and the occasional nurse. You are to lie still, eat well, and, above all, rest. For weeks, possibly months. The idea that your anxiety, your trembling, your nervous complaint will resolve itself through enforced passivity. Because clearly what an overwhelmed woman needs is more restriction, less expression, and a whole lot of staring at the ceiling. One mainstream historical fact: the rest cure was developed by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell in the late 1800s and was especially popular in the United States and Britain. It was prescribed mostly to upper-class women who were seen as overstimulated by modern life or overly ambitious. That's right, too much thinking was thought to cause collapse. The cure involved isolation, overfeeding, massage, and electrotherapy, all intended to build up a woman's body while quieting her mind. Men, by the way, received a slightly different version, the West Cure, which involved horseback riding, hunting, and camping. Manly silence. Your treatment begins with silence. The nurse, a woman who says very little and moves like she's been trained not to leave footprints, removes your books. The physician checks your pulse with one hand while writing your chart with the other. Classic exhaustion, he mutters. Mental overuse. You wonder what that even means. You had a few thoughts and now you're on bed of rest. You lie back and watch a fly trace the same square on the ceiling over and over. You want to ask where it's going. You want to ask why, but instead you count the seconds between footsteps in the hallway. Some scholars argue that the rest cure was a response to growing unease about women's roles in society. As women began seeking education, pursuing writing careers, and even, speaking out on social issues, the medical establishment responded with a form of therapeutic containment. If a woman wanted to think, she must be ill. If she wanted to write, she was straining herself. If she resisted the mold, she must be melting. Sound familiar? And yet, it wasn't just the cure itself, it was the way it invalidated women's experiences. One of the most famous patients of the rest cure was Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the writer and activist who penned The Yellow Wallpaper, a short story that remains one of the most chilling portraits of a woman losing her mind under the weight of being silenced. Gilman was prescribed rest, forbidden to write, and told to focus on being a wife and mother. Her reaction? she wrote a fictionalized version of her descent into madness where the wallpaper itself becomes a prison, its patterns mocking her as she stares endlessly at its twisting vines. The story is fiction, but it feels more like prophecy. You shift in your bed, the mattress sinking just enough to feel like it's trying to swallow you. A nurse brings a tray, milk, eggs, toast, heavy foods. The point is to fatten you up, as if calories can insulate you from sadness. You're weighed weekly, praised for sleeping, discouraged from walking. And here's the kicker. Many of the women who underwent the rest cure described their anxiety getting worse. Why wouldn't it? Imagine being told your distress is not only invisible but inappropriate. Imagine being punished with silence for the crime of crying out. But not everyone followed the script. There are reports of women who smuggled in notebooks, wrote poems on scraps of cloth, whispered ideas into pillows just to hear themselves speak. Others developed quiet rituals, flicking the corner of a blanket 3 times, counting backward from 100 in different languages to maintain a sliver of control. One fringe detail: some patients were told that laughter was too stimulating. If you laughed too often or too loudly, it was seen as a sign of regression. That's right, even joy could be misdiagnosed, but the rest cure wasn't always about total stillness. Some variations involve massage and electrotherapy, applying weak electrical currents to muscles to prevent atrophy. This part was more about the body than the mind, but it felt clinical and cold. Imagine being massaged by someone who never meets your eyes, while a humming device pulses beneath your skin. And yet, there's something strangely dystopian about the whole thing. Not because it's violent, but because it's emptily kind. The room is warm, the sheets are clean. No one is yelling, but the silence is a cage lined with silk. You lie back and listen to your own heartbeat, louder now that there's nothing else to distract you. Your thoughts spiral. What did you do to end up here? Was it your ambition, your grief, the way your voice cracked when you said you were tired? Or did you simply exist too visibly? Some historians have called the rest cure a form of benevolent imprisonment, a medical strategy that neutralized women's voices under the pretense of care. It didn't heal, it sedated. But here's where it gets more complicated. There were some women, very few, who said it helped. They described the isolation as peaceful, the quiet as soothing. Was it the treatment itself, or just the first time anyone had stopped demanding something from them? That's still debated. You get up from the bed one day and shuffle to the window, just a sliver of outside. A bird hops along the sill. You press your hand to the glass and feel the cold bleed into your fingertips. You're not cured, you're just dulled. And soon the doctor returns with a new idea. Perhaps surgery, he says, flipping through his notes. Something to remove the source of the disturbance. You swallow. You know what's coming next. They think the problem isn't in your mind or even your blood, but in your body itself. Specifically, in your uterus. But don't worry, that's for tomorrow. Tonight you just lie there, full of milk and silence, wondering what part of yourself they'll want to cut out next. You sit perfectly still in a stiff wooden chair, while the doctor explains the procedure in a tone so calm it almost sounds like he's describing a change in the weather. The room smells like carbolic acid and polished brass. Every surface is too clean, too cold. His assistant stands by, sharpening a scalpel with rhythmic strokes, like he's getting ready to carve Sunday roast. You try to follow the words: uterus, nerves, removal, relief. But your brain keeps stalling on the one word that echoes the loudest: surgery. They want to take out your uterus, to cure your anxiety. And you thought the leeches were bad. This isn't medieval torture anymore. This is 19th century scientific advancement. Progress. It's the age of chloroform, white coats, and long Latin words that dress up cruelty as compassion. And if you're a woman suffering from what they call hysterical melancholia, nervous fits, or simply too much feeling, there's a growing movement in the medical world that says your womb is the problem. Again, one mainstream historical fact. In the mid to late 1800s, hysterectomies, surgical removal of the uterus, were not uncommon as a treatment for mental illness in women. Physicians argued that the uterus influenced emotional stability. If a woman was anxious, depressed, or prone to hysterics, removing the uterus might restore calm. No uterus, no problem. You might be wondering, how did this logic even develop? Well, it started with the old belief that the uterus had a life of its own. Remember the wandering womb? Now add the new 19th century idea that female reproductive organs somehow corrupted the nervous system. Some doctors believed the uterus was a kind of internal parasite, sending distress signals to the brain and disrupting emotional balance. Removing it, they claimed, would sever that line of miscommunication. Of course, it didn't help that medicine at the time was overwhelmingly male and paternalistic. Women weren't asked what they felt. They were told, and when they resisted or protested, that was often seen as proof they were unwell. Even more disturbing, many of these surgeries were performed without proper consent. A woman might enter a hospital for nervous complaints and leave without a uterus. In asylums particularly, procedures were often done under the justification of public safety or moral hygiene. Sometimes husbands or fathers approved them without consulting the woman at all. You lie back on a surgical table. The ceiling above you is stained with something you don't want to name. A nurse holds your wrist and murmurs that everything will be better soon. There's a mask over your face. The scent of chloroform creeps into your sinuses, soft and sickly sweet, pulling the edges of your vision into shadow. You're told this is the answer, that this will make the world quieter, that when you wake up, the sadness will be gone. But what they remove is not just an organ, it's a part of you, it's symbolic. The procedure is a surgical declaration that your femininity, your capacity for life, is the source of your dysfunction. Your emotional pain isn't treated with kindness or understanding, it's handled with steel. Some fringe historical accounts mention surgeons performing clitoridectomies and oophorectomies, removal of the ovaries as well, believing that sexual excess or menstrual irregularity contributed to hysteria. The logic is, of course, horrifically flawed and deeply misogynistic. If you remove the part associated with femininity, maybe the madness goes with them. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Many women experienced worsened symptoms post-surgery. Depression deepened, anxiety spiked, and physically, the pain lingered. Pelvic cramping, hormonal imbalances, early onset menopause. But instead of revising the diagnosis, physicians often blamed the patient. She resisted healing, they said. She's predisposed to weakness. Some scholars argue these surgeries were less about curing and more about control, a way to silence, to subdue, to erase complexity. If a woman couldn't be calmed through bed rest, drained through leeches, or silenced through isolation, then maybe she could be cut into obedience. You wake up groggy, disoriented. The nurse presses a damp cloth to your forehead and says it's over. You're new now, she says, like you've been upgraded. But something in your chest feels colder, heavier. You don't know what they took. Not fully, but you can feel the absence. Like someone turned the volume down on your body and forgot to turn it back up. And here's a thought that sticks with you. What if the anxiety wasn't in your uterus? What if it was in how no one ever listened to you? That's the part that history rarely questioned, because as long as they could point to your body, they didn't have to listen to your mind. One open scholarly debate centers around how many women were subjected to hysterectomy for emotional or psychiatric reasons. Exact records are murky, and many case files simply note uterine pathology or functional disorder. Historians still argue whether doctors truly believed in the mental benefits or whether these procedures were a last resort born of frustration. Was it misguided healing or quiet punishment? And not all women went quietly. Some resisted, some escaped, some wrote letters, desperate, angry, eloquent letters documenting their experiences. A few doctors began to question the ethics. A tiny handful even advocated for talk-based therapy, community care, or alternative healing methods. But those voices were quiet. drowned out by the clinking of surgical instruments and the endless echo of the word hysteria. And now, here you are, sitting up slowly in a stiff hospital bed, the bandages tight around your waist. The doctor enters and nods with pride. "You'll find your nerves calmer now," he says, as if your soul was an infection to be drained. You don't answer, because what would you say? That the silence inside you is louder now? That something essential was taken, not just physically, but emotionally? That you weren't healed? You were emptied? Outside the window, life continues. A child laughs, a cart rattles down the street. A woman in a red shawl walks by, clutching a basket of apples like they're secrets. The world moves on, always, but for you something has stopped. You lie back again and try to remember who you were before they called you ill, before they told you your anxiety made you broken, before they marked your womanhood as something to be corrected. But don't worry, the next phase of treatment will be gentler, not better, just gentler. In fact, it might involve a machine, one that vibrates, and no, it's not what you think. Or maybe it is. Stay tuned. The room is bright, unusually so, lit by natural daylight spilling through lace-curtained windows and bouncing off polished wood floors. Everything here is quiet and clean, filled with a strange air of calm professionalism. You sit on a padded examination table in a long skirt and high-button blouse, while the physician, dressed neatly in a dark suit, finishes scribbling notes in a leather-bound journal. There's no talk of bloodletting today, no leeches, no cutting. Instead, he gestures toward a curious machine in the corner. It hums softly, mechanical and innocent. "This will relax you," he says. "It's a very modern method, quite effective for hysteria." Welcome to the invention of the electromechanical vibrator, a device originally created not for pleasure, but for therapy. That's right. You've entered one of the strangest, most ironic chapters in the history of women's mental health. The 19th century was obsessed with hysteria. It was the go-to diagnosis for almost any psychological or emotional disturbance in women. You're anxious? Hysteria. You cry a lot? Hysteria. You're bored and daydreamy and full of unnamed yearning? Definitely hysteria. And one of the more popular treatments at the time was pelvic massage, administered by doctors as a medical service. Yes, that kind of massage. The logic went something like this. Many physicians believed that congestion in the uterus or surrounding areas could cause nervous symptoms, and by massaging the pelvis until the woman reached what was euphemistically referred to as paroxysm, her nerves would reset and her mind would calm. A mainstream historical fact. Before vibrators were invented, physicians, almost always male, performed this massage manually. It could take hours, and some doctors complained of fatigue in the wrists. In the 1880s, British physician Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville invented the first electromechanical vibrator to reduce the physical strain on practitioners. His device wasn't invented for intimacy, it was invented for efficiency. And it worked. Not in the way doctors expected, but in the way everyone else might have guessed. Patients often left these sessions relieved and refreshed. The doctors chalked it up to successful treatment. Most were so medically oblivious to female sexuality that they didn't realize they were inducing orgasms in a clinical setting. Or worse, they knew and simply pretended not to. You sit still as the doctor applies the device with a soft hum and zero eye contact. The session lasts about 20 minutes. You're told to come back twice a week. You walk out the door with your cheeks flushed and your anxiety oddly quiet. Is it healing? Is it repression in disguise? Or is it something in between? Some scholars argue that the development and wide use of the vibrator as a medical device was a direct result of a culture that both feared and ignored female sexuality. Women were not supposed to have sexual desires of their own, yet they were regularly treated with an orgasm by proxy that everyone refused to name. That's the absurdity. Pleasure was medicalized, clinical, and treated like a symptom relief method rather than a normal part of being human. One fringe detail vibrators became one of the first electrical appliances sold for home use, arriving before the vacuum cleaner and the electric iron. Ads in women's magazines in the early 1900s showed elegant drawings of the devices with the language like personal massager and nerve relief at home. The phrasing was coy, the implications obvious, and sales were excellent. You return for another appointment a week later. The waiting room is full. Middle-aged women knitting, young women flipping through thin booklets. The mood is quiet but not somber. There's an air of resigned familiarity to it all. Like everyone here knows this ritual. You wonder if anyone talks about it at home, or if they pretend the visits are for migraines or digestion. Some historians still debate how widespread this practice was. There's little documentation from patients themselves. Most of the available writing comes from physicians' journals, and unsurprisingly, those documents lack introspection. But the pattern is there: hysteria, pelvic massage, mechanical aid, repeat. Some suggest that this approach to treating women's nerves lasted well into the 1920s, fading only when psychiatry and talk therapy began to take more cultural space, and when the association between vibrators and female pleasure became a little too obvious. One open scholarly debate centers around whether these physicians were truly oblivious or willfully blind. Did they genuinely not understand the nature of what they were doing? Or did they choose language that sanitized their work to maintain control and social decorum? Either way, women weren't consulted, as usual. And now, looking back, it's impossible not to see the irony. The same society that punished women for desire also created a covert system to treat them with unacknowledged intimacy. Female sexuality was treated like a nervous condition, something to be soothed, not celebrated. And yet, for many women, these treatments may have been the only time their bodies were acknowledged at all. You stand in front of a mirror, hair pinned up, collar straight, wondering how to name what just happened. You can't. There's no vocabulary for it. You feel better, lighter, grounded, but not because someone listened to your mind, not because someone understood your story. You feel better because someone accidentally touched something that made you feel human for a moment, and then the moment ends. You return home. The tea is lukewarm. Your husband asks how the appointment went. You say, fine, and sit down to sew a torn sleeve. But there's something different about the way you breathe, about the way you sit, about the way your fingers press against the fabric. For once, your body was the answer, not the problem. It's strange how much comfort can come from an accident. How something designed to reduce a doctor's workload could provide a moment of calm to a woman who spent her life being told her feelings are inconvenient. You think back to the woman with the herbal pouch, the one muttering spells, the one who burned sage and whispered to shadows. She didn't have machines, but maybe she understood what mattered, that healing isn't always about fixing, sometimes it's about feeling. And yet the story moves on. The machines get quieter, smaller. They disappear from doctors' offices and show up in hidden drawers. Meanwhile, another wave of treatment rises on the horizon, one that doesn't involve touch at all. One that sounds more modern, more scientific, more sterile. Electricity, but this time it isn't a gentle hum, it's a jolt. And they'll say it's for your own good. You're back in a room with walls that echo. Everything here hums, not with energy, but with emptiness. The bed is metal, the sheets a shade of white that feels too clean to be real. A small window lets in light, but the glass is frosted, as if the outside world is too dangerous to see. You're in an asylum now, a rest home or sanatorium depending on who's writing the brochure. But make no mistake, this is where society puts the women who feel too much, speak too loudly, or collapse too often. Your diagnosis? Hysteria, or neurasthenia, or nervous exhaustion. The name changes depending on the decade, but the assumption stays the same. You're emotionally unstable, fragile, possibly dangerous, certainly inconvenient. You weren't always here. First, there were visits to the doctor, who prescribed tonics and long walks and a more agreeable attitude. Then came the spells, those dizzying, tear-filled nights, the numb mornings, the growing fog in your chest that made even brushing your hair feel like a punishment. Eventually, someone, your father, your husband, maybe even your employer, said you needed a break, a little time away for rest. But they never asked what from. You didn't pack your own bags. You didn't choose this bed. And now here you are, sitting at the edge of it, hands folded, trying not to tremble as the nurse enters with your first dose of bromide, a sedative that promises peace, but tastes like metal and regret. One mainstream historical fact. By the late 1800s and well into the 20th century, thousands of women were institutionalized for reasons we now recognize as everyday mental health struggles. Anxiety, postpartum depression, trauma responses. Many of them were perfectly sane, but lived in a world that made sanity impossible. If you cried too often or failed to smile at the right time, you were called uncooperative. If you dissociated to survive an abusive marriage, you were diagnosed with psychosis. And if you simply stopped pretending to be okay, you were told to lie down and stay quiet. And silence is the main prescription here. You aren't allowed to talk to other patients for the first 2 weeks. No writing, no books, no outside contact. You're escorted to meals, escorted to your bath, escorted back to your room. Everything is whitewashed and rigid, like the building itself is trying to erase you. There are bars on the windows, but the real prison isn't made of metal. It's the way your name vanishes behind your file number, the way your emotions are translated into symptoms, the way your fear becomes agitation, your silence becomes withdrawal. You start to realize that here, the more human you are, the more ill you appear. One day, a woman across the hall screams for hours. The nurses give her an injection, and she falls asleep with her head against the door. Another woman mutters to herself in the garden, fingering rosary beads as if they're her last thread of memory. You see yourself in both of them, and you wonder how long before you become part of the furniture. One fringe detail. In some early 20th century asylums, women who worked in sewing rooms or laundry facilities were rewarded with extra silence. An hour alone in the courtyard, no conversation allowed. Quiet was considered a privilege, even though it was the very thing that kept you invisible. It's a cruel paradox. The more they deprive you of human connection, the more they reward you for adapting to it. There's a therapy room you're sometimes taken to. It has chairs bolted to the floor and a small piano in the corner. Once a week, a nurse reads aloud from a magazine, her voice flat, like she's performing the role of a human. You're told to sit still and absorb something nice. You think about asking a question, but you remember what happened last time someone did. They didn't return for dinner. Another woman, Margaret, sits beside you. She used to be a teacher. She came here after losing her third child and refusing to get out of bed for 2 weeks. Her husband said she'd lost her reason. Margaret's hands shake when she drinks tea, but she always offers you the sugar first. It's the kindest moment you get all day. But even kindness here feels like contraband. One open scholarly debate is how many of the women institutionalized during this period were actually experiencing mental illness versus how many were simply caught in the crosshairs of patriarchal expectations. Historians pore over admission records, looking at the reasons listed: disobedient, argumentative, overly religious, melancholic since marriage. Some were victims of postpartum disorders, others survivors of abuse. But what they had in common was that their suffering made someone else uncomfortable, and institutions became the broom closet for society's discomfort. There are cold baths, supposedly to stimulate the nerves. You sit shivering while a nurse scrubs your skin as if your thoughts are something she can wash away. There are straitjackets, too, not as common as in movies, but used often enough when women acted out or refused medication. They say it's for safety, but it's hard to feel safe when your body is no longer yours. The walls here don't echo your voice, they absorb it. The longer you stay, the more you begin to second-guess yourself. Was I always this fragile? Did I make this up? Am I broken? That's part of the design, because if you stop trusting your own mind, you'll stop trying to reclaim it. Still, there are moments, small ones. The way sunlight hits the tile at just the right angle, the way Margaret hums an old lullaby under her breath, The way a new nurse, young and not yet worn down, smiles at you, like she sees something besides your diagnosis. These are the crumbs of hope, and you collect them greedily. One day you're allowed to walk outside, just for 15 minutes. You breathe the cold air like it's a secret. The garden is sparse, mostly stone and moss, but a single weed grows in a crack by the steps. A burst of green where it shouldn't be. You kneel beside it and touch the leaves with your fingertips. And for the first time in weeks, you feel real. They might have locked the doors, but you're still here. You're still you. It's hard to say what heals and what harms in a place like this. For some women, the asylum is a graveyard of identity. For others, paradoxically, it's the first time anyone acknowledged they were suffering at all. But acknowledgement isn't the same as care. And as more and more women are institutionalized, sometimes for decades, public opinion begins to shift. Slowly, unevenly, but it shifts. Advocacy grows. Reform movements emerge. Some brave doctors, many of them women, begin to speak out against the system. The tide doesn't turn all at once, but the idea that maybe anxiety is something to be treated with listening instead of locking up starts to take hold. Eventually, you're discharged. The papers say improved, not recovered, never understood. You return to a world that hasn't changed, but you have. You're quieter now, but not because you were fixed, because now you know how loud the silence can be. And if anyone asks what it was like, you'll smile politely and say, "It helped." But inside, you'll remember the weed in the garden, the song Margaret hummed. The moment you realize that healing doesn't always come in pills or institutions. Sometimes it comes in remembering that you were never crazy, just unheard. You're seated in a plush armchair now, not a cell or a hospital bed. The walls are still white, but they're softened by bookshelves and velvet curtains. There's a fire flickering gently in the hearth. The room smells faintly of tobacco and expensive paper. Across from you sits a man with a magnificent beard and an intense, probing stare. He adjusts his spectacles, opens his notebook, and leans forward with all the seriousness of someone preparing to unravel the entire human soul. "Tell me about your father," he says. "Welcome to the early 20th century. Welcome to Sigmund Freud. The straitjackets are gone. The leeches have been retired. You're no longer locked up for weeping. Now your anxiety is a puzzle, a riddle buried deep in your unconscious mind. And the man across from you believes that if you just say enough words, if you just talk long enough, he can find the root of your suffering. It's a new kind of therapy, less invasive, more intellectual, and yet somehow still entirely centered around the idea that your inner life is wrong. Freud's theories revolutionized the treatment of emotional distress. He introduced the concept of the unconscious, the idea that much of what we think and feel is influenced by hidden desires and unresolved conflicts. He believed that neurosis, including anxiety, came from repressed emotions, especially those related to childhood, sexuality, and family. A mainstream historical fact. Freud coined the term hysteria as a psychological, not physical condition. He believed that many of the women he saw were suffering not from uterine diseases or misaligned humors, but from emotional trauma, often rooted in early experiences. He pioneered the use of talk therapy as a way to access those buried memories and work through them. It was a shift, a big one. For the first time, women's pain was being acknowledged as psychological rather than bodily misbehavior. But before you get too comfortable, let's not forget, Freud also believed that at the center of all this distress was sexual repression, specifically female sexual repression, and even more specifically, the inability to reconcile the absence of a penis. Yes, we're talking about the Oedipus complex and penis envy, cornerstones of Freudian psychoanalysis that haven't exactly aged well. One open scholarly debate, whether Freud was truly listening to women or simply reinterpreting their stories to fit his pre-existing theories. Some argue he gave voice to female pain for the first time in medical history. Others say he merely replaced one form of control with another, recasting women's feelings as neurotic if they didn't conform to the narratives he invented. You sit there, across from him, trying to explain the weight in your chest, the way your breath catches when you're alone too long, the dreams that leave you shaken and ashamed. He nods solemnly, then begins scribbling. Repressed libido, he mutters. Electra complex. You're not sure how those words apply to your life, but they get written down anyway. He asks about your mother, about your adolescence, about your dreams. When you mention a memory of running through a field and laughing, he pauses. What were you running from? He asks. Not who were you running toward, not what made you happy. Always the shadow, always the wound. Freud's approach was groundbreaking in some ways. It challenged the purely physical explanations of anxiety that had dominated for centuries. He saw emotion as real, as meaningful, but he also framed much of women's distress through a lens of deficiency. You weren't just anxious, you were incomplete. You weren't just sad, you were subconsciously jealous of male power, male anatomy, male everything. And if you disagreed, that was just more proof that he was right. It's exhausting. You want to ask him, what if the problem isn't my desire for power, but the fact that I'm denied it? What if the anxiety isn't repressed sexuality, but the gnawing realization that I have no control over my life, that the world is built to ignore me, to limit me, to dismiss every thought I dare to speak aloud? But you don't ask, because you've learned that in this room, every protest becomes a symptom. Still, the process of talking does something. It stirs things up. You leave the sessions feeling raw, stripped down, sometimes lighter, sometimes angrier. There's no cure here, no miracle, but there is space, a small, velvet-lined space where your mind is allowed to exist, even if misunderstood. Over time, Freud's ideas spread across Europe and the United States. Psychoanalysis becomes fashionable among the wealthy elite. It's chic to have a therapist, to talk about your mother, to interpret your dreams, but it's still mostly reserved for those with money, education, and access. Women of the working class, they're still being sent to sanatoriums, or handed pills, or ignored entirely. And even among the wealthy, the language of therapy often becomes another tool of shame. Women are told they're too emotional, too dependent, too frigid, too hysterical, too sexual, too repressed. The terms change, but the verdict stays the same. You are the problem. One fringe detail. Early psychoanalytic journals occasionally included bizarre case studies, like a woman who was said to suffer from hysteria because she dreamed of sea monsters, interpreted naturally as phallic symbols, and proof of sexual confusion. Another woman was diagnosed after confessing she disliked corsets, clearly a symptom of maternal rejection, or maybe just comfort. As absurd as it sounds now, these interpretations shaped decades of therapy. Women learned to question their instincts, their memories, their sanity. If you felt fine, maybe you were in denial. If you felt awful, maybe that was progress. Either way, the diagnosis stuck. Still, despite its flaws, psychoanalysis cracked open a door. Freud was followed by others, Jung, Adler, Klein, each adding their own theories, and eventually women themselves began entering the field. Therapists who listened without judgment, who questioned the foundations, who didn't assume that your sadness must trace back to the shape of your anatomy. You lie in bed one night after a session, your thoughts unspooling like a thread. You think about the women who came before, the ones burned as witches, bled to quiet, locked away in padded cells. You think about the electric machines, the surgical knives, the silent meals in white rooms. And you realize, even here in a carpeted office with polished bookcases and a man with a beard who speaks gently, the same current runs beneath it all. You are a puzzle, not a person, but something's shifting now. You can feel it. A sense that maybe, just maybe, your anxiety isn't a malfunction, but a message. Not an illness, but a language no one's bothered to learn. And if that's true, then maybe it's time you learn to speak it yourself. You're lying down again, but this time it's different. The room is dim and humming, not with quiet or calm, but with raw electricity. Leather straps lie near your arms, not yet fastened, but ominously present. A nurse stands to the side, expression neutral, while a doctor checks the machine one last time. There's a cold, wet pad pressed to your forehead, and wires snake from your temples to a humming box that's supposed to fix you. Just a small dose, the doctor says, as if he's offering you tea. This will calm the nerves. You nod, because what else can you do? This is electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, the next frontier in treating what they still call nervous illness in women. It's the mid-20th century now, and the psychological world is moving on from Freud's couches and into machines, wires, currents, and clinical precision. Emotional pain is no longer the result of wandering wombs or hidden desires. Now it's viewed as a misfiring circuit, a chemical imbalance, a glitch in your system that needs to be shocked back into place. And shock they do. One mainstream historical fact. Electroconvulsive therapy was first introduced in the 1930s by Italian neurologists Ugo Cerletti and Lucio Bini. It quickly gained popularity as a treatment for a range of psychiatric conditions, including depression, mania, and schizophrenia. By the 1940s and 50s, it was widely used in mental institutions across Europe and America, especially on women. You're told it's for your anxiety, your episodes, your tendency to disappear into thought, to cry in patterns they can't predict. ECT is sold to you as a cure, quick, effective, and, according to your file, medically indicated. What they don't tell you is that it's terrifying. The hum of the machine grows louder. You breathe in short, shallow bursts. A rubber guard is placed between your teeth so you don't bite through your tongue. The doctor checks your vitals. The nurse nods, and then they press the switch. There's no elegant way to describe what happens. Your body seizes. Your back arches. Your vision goes white. For a moment, the world leaves you. When you come back, you're groggy, confused. There's a ringing in your ears and a stutter in your thoughts. You don't remember your name right away, or what day it is, or how many treatments you've already had, but you're still here. Just a little dimmer. One fringe historical fact: during the early years of ECT, anesthesia wasn't always used. Patients were awake during the procedure. Many broke teeth, dislocated jaws, or suffered spinal injuries from the force of the convulsions. Anesthetics and muscle relaxants weren't standardized until much later, making early treatments both painful and dangerous. Yet, despite the trauma, many doctors swore by it. ECT seemed to produce results, at least on the surface. Patients were quieter afterward, calmer. They smiled more, or at least stopped screaming. But was that healing, or simply the dulling of resistance? In the mid-century asylum system, compliance was often mistaken for recovery. Some women described ECT as a kind of erasure, a forced forgetting. "I felt like a house someone had emptied," one survivor later wrote. "The furniture was gone and the lights didn't work, but the front door was still open." Others, however, reported relief, temporary, uneven, but real. For some, the jolts broke the spiral, the noise stopped, the dread lifted, the depression thinned. But even those women rarely returned by choice, and very few had the power to say no. One open scholarly debate is whether the early forms of ECT were ever truly ethical. Consent was often not properly obtained. Information was rarely shared. Women were signed up for treatment by husbands, fathers, even social workers, based on behavioral reports that use words like moody, disobedient, restless, talkative, withdrawn. And who among us hasn't been all those things? You wake up in the recovery room, a cool cloth pressed to your forehead. There's a fog in your head like cotton. You can't remember what you had for breakfast, or what year it is. The nurse says you've been here a week. You believe her, but only because there's no other version to believe. Later that afternoon, you're brought to the common room. Other women sit silently in chairs, knitting or staring at a television with the sound off. One woman rocks slightly, whispering a song you almost recognize. Another stares at her hands like she's just met them for the first time. This is the post-ECT ward, the in-between place, a liminal zone of the nearly well and the no longer resisting. You sit beside a woman named Ruth. She used to be a writer. You can tell from the way her eyes flicker when the nurses bring her a notepad she's no longer allowed to use. She tells you quietly that she used to have dreams, big ones. But they shocked them out of me, she says with a dry laugh. Left me a nice, quiet emptiness instead. And yet it wasn't all black and white. Some psychiatrists tried to use ECT with care. Some introduce consent forms, follow-ups, and discussion. Some listen, a few even challenge the entire system, arguing that trauma, not imbalance, was at the root of anxiety, that maybe these women needed understanding, not electricity. They were often ignored, but they existed. Eventually, ECT began to fall out of favor. Scandals emerged, stories leaked. Books and films like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest captured public horror. Advocacy groups rose up, demanding patient rights, consent protocols, transparency. Mental health reform swept through the 1970s and 80s, slowly replacing asylums with community clinics and therapy centers. And yet, ECT never fully vanished. Even today, it's still used, more safely now. With anesthesia, with consent, sometimes with genuine documented benefits, for treatment-resistant depression, for severe suicidal ideation. But the history lingers, especially for women, because so often the choice to use it wasn't theirs. And choice, more than anything, is what was always missing. You leave the hospital with your memory spotty and your thoughts rearranged. But you're told you're better. You look better. You don't cry in front of people. You don't stare at walls. You smile on cue. They call that progress, but you know better. Because there's a version of you that still lives in that room, still strapped down, still humming, still waiting for someone to ask the right question instead of reaching for the switch. You walk slowly through the outside world again. Cars pass. People bustle. You wear a hat and gloves. You sip tea with friends who don't ask why you were gone. You look like everyone else, but the current still hums under your skin, a low, quiet buzz, a warning, and then one day someone gives you a pill, small, pale, harmless looking, and they say, "This one will help you sleep." You smile politely and place it on your tongue, not knowing that you've just entered the next phase of the story. You're sitting at the kitchen table in a quiet suburban home, the kind where the wallpaper has delicate floral patterns and the linoleum floor squeaks just a little when you move your chair. A newspaper is folded beside your teacup, and the radio hums in the background, playing something soft, something that sounds like it belongs to someone else's life. Your husband just left for work, the kids are at school, the house is clean, everything is calm, and yet your hands are shaking. You reach into the drawer and pull out a small amber bottle with a crisp white label. The cap clicks off with a practiced twist. You place a tiny pale pill on your tongue and chase it with cold coffee from this morning. Then you sit back and wait for the quiet to arrive. Welcome to the 1950s, where women's anxiety is finally being acknowledged, sort of. It's the post-war era, and the world is back to business, babies, and brand new appliances. But behind the picket fences and cheery commercials, something's fraying. And so, enter the age of tranquilizers. One mainstream historical fact. In 1955, Milltown, the first widely prescribed tranquilizer, hit the market. Soon after came Valium and Librium. These drugs were marketed directly to housewives as a cure for nervous tension, stress, and what doctors called mild emotional disturbances. Within a decade, millions of American women were taking them daily. It was a pharmaceutical revolution and a cultural one. If earlier centuries locked anxious women away, the 1950s simply medicated them into submission. No need for straitjackets, electrodes, or surgery now. Just a tiny pill that made the discontent dissolve like sugar in hot tea. The messaging was everywhere. Magazine ads showed glamorous women smiling as they did dishes. Captions reading things like, "You can cope again, thanks to science." One ad even promised that tranquilizers could help women be themselves again, though no one ever asked what that actually meant, or whether they'd ever been allowed to be themselves in the first place. You stand in front of the mirror in your pastel kitchen apron and whisper affirmations like you've been told. You're a good wife, a good mother. You're not overwhelmed. You're not tired. You're fine. But the tightness in your chest says otherwise. The truth is, your life is full of contradictions. You're told to be fulfilled by domestic life, but no one tells you how to handle the quiet between the chores. You're encouraged to be soft, emotional, maternal, but only on schedule and never too loudly. You're supposed to be grateful. And if you aren't, that's a personal failing, a nervous condition. That's where the pills come in. One fringe detail, the term mother's little helper, was popularized by a Rolling Stones song in the 1960s, referring to the widespread use of Valium among housewives. It became shorthand for the way society dulled women's unrest without ever addressing its cause. And that unrest? It was growing. Some scholars argue that the 1950s were a pressure cooker for women, especially white middle-class women, who were pushed into rigid domestic roles after World War II. During the war, many had worked in factories, led households, tasted autonomy. When the men returned, the message was clear: get back in the kitchen, be happy about it. But emotional whiplash doesn't disappear with a smile. So instead of asking why so many women were anxious, the culture asked, what can we give them to make them quiet again? You remember watching a commercial once, sleek, black and white, with a voiceover as smooth as the pills it advertised. A woman stood at the stove, a little flustered. Then she took a tablet, and magically she was calm again. Her husband came home to a clean house and a perfect roast. She smiled at him, serene and pretty. You wonder if that woman ever screamed into a pillow when the cameras were off. The thing is, these medications did help. At least for a while. They took the edge off, slowed the racing thoughts, made it possible to breathe through the overwhelm. And for some women, they were lifesavers. But the pills weren't accompanied by therapy, or questions, or support. They were a Band-Aid placed over a wound no one wanted to see, and soon that Band-Aid became a burden. One open scholarly debate involves the extent to which pharmaceutical companies knowingly marketed to women's pain without addressing its roots. Some historians argue that drug ads played on insecurities, pushing the idea that any discontent was pathological. Others point out that these ads were responding to a real and overwhelming need. Millions of women were desperate for something to make life livable. You visit the doctor again. He asks how you're feeling in a tone that suggests he already knows the answer. You say, a little better. He nods and writes a refill. No follow-up, no questions. You leave the office with another bottle and the strange feeling that you've both passed a test and failed it. At the pharmacy, the woman in line behind you gives you a knowing look. You wonder what she's taking. You wonder if you'll be on this medication forever. Because there's a secret no one tells you. The pills don't fix the loneliness. They don't fix the suffocation. They don't change the fact that your entire identity has been compressed into how clean your floor is and whether your husband smiles at dinner. You sit at home later, watching the kids play in the yard. You think about your own mother, about how she coped. You remember her crying in the pantry, wiping her eyes before anyone noticed. She didn't have Valium. She had coffee and obligation. Now, at least, you have something. But you still feel the hum beneath it all. That quiet, persistent ache. The kind that can't be named because there's no space in the conversation for it. And the more you suppress it, the sharper it becomes. It's no wonder, then, that something new begins to rise. In whispered conversations, in late-night reading groups, in pamphlets passed from hand to hand. A growing realization, maybe it's not me, maybe the system is broken, and that realization will change everything. Because soon women will start naming their pain and shouting it and writing it in books and speeches and on signs held high in protest. The pills won't be enough anymore, because the cure for this anxiety isn't silence, it's rage. But gentle rage, the kind that writes essays and rewrites laws, the kind that walks out of kitchens and into classrooms, courtrooms, publishing houses, the kind that dares to say, I'm not broken, I'm awake. And if that sounds like revolution, good, it's long overdue. You're standing now, not in a hospital, not in a therapist's office, not on the linoleum of your kitchen floor, but in a street filled with voices. The sound is not angry, not violent, it's electric, it's focused. Around you, women hold signs that read things like, "The personal is political and not your hysteria anymore." Someone hands you a leaflet titled, "Consciousness Raising Circles, Tuesday nights at 7. You fold it carefully into your coat pocket, unsure why your heart's racing, relief maybe, or recognition, because for the first time your anxiety isn't being pathologized, it's being validated. Welcome to the feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s, where women finally begin to reframe their emotional struggles not as internal failures, but as the natural consequences of being silenced, pressured, dismissed, and held hostage by unrealistic expectations. The story of women's anxiety enters a new phase, one that doesn't whisper or weep, but speaks clearly and unapologetically. You walk through the crowd, past pamphlets about bodily autonomy, mental health collectives, and gendered labor. You pause at a booth where a young woman is reading aloud from a stapled zine. Her voice shakes, but she doesn't stop. "I was told I was depressed," she says, "because I cried at night and felt like my life had no meaning. But maybe I wasn't depressed. Maybe I was just bored and suffocating in a world that only saw me as a mother and a wife." You feel the truth of it settle in your chest. One mainstream historical fact. The second wave feminist movement brought mental health into the political conversation. Writers like Betty Friedan and Adrienne Rich began to name the ways domestic life had stifled women. Friedan's The Feminine Mystique described the problem that has no name, a deep existential dissatisfaction experienced by millions of women who were told they had everything they should want, and yet felt hollow. And that hollowness? It had been medicalized for decades, brushed away with pills, shocked out with wires, cut out with scalpels. But now it was being reclaimed. Your anxiety wasn't a defect. It was a reaction, a message, an alarm that had been going off for centuries, muffled under the weight of corsets, marriages, prescriptions, and institutions. You sit on the floor of a small apartment later that night. There are 10 other women with you. You pass around tea in mismatched mugs. The air is thick with nervous honesty. One woman talks about her panic attacks. Another speaks of postnatal depression that went undiagnosed for years. A third admits she hasn't felt like a person since her wedding day. This is consciousness raising, and it's not therapy. It's solidarity. It's the realization that what you thought was just you is actually everywhere. That your symptoms have patterns, that your pain is not a weakness. That being human in a system designed to flatten you will make you sick, but that sickness is not your fault. One fringe historical detail: feminist collectives in cities like Boston, Chicago, and San Francisco began creating underground clinics and publishing self-help health manuals. Our Bodies, Ourselves became a landmark text, teaching women not only about anatomy, but about emotions, trauma, and the intersection of mental and physical health. You read it cover to cover, twice. It's the first book that doesn't make you feel like a question mark. And here's where the real shift happens. Women start becoming the experts. They enter psychology programs. They become therapists. They research gender bias and diagnosis. They ask why women are more likely to be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, or why men are more often treated for substance abuse while women are labeled emotionally unstable. They ask who defines normal, who gets to say what's healthy, and who benefits from keeping women ashamed of their own pain. These questions burn through academia, healthcare, even media, and the answers change lives. You find a new kind of doctor now, someone who listens. She doesn't ask if you're coping. She asks how you feel. When you describe the fog in your mind, the pressure behind your eyes, the dread that creeps in before bed, she doesn't suggest you get more sleep or count your blessings. She says, "That makes sense." And those 3 words, they land softer than any pill you've ever taken. One open scholarly debate is how much modern psychiatry has actually evolved since this period. Yes, more women are in positions of influence. Yes, diagnostic criteria have improved, but bias lingers. Studies still show that women's physical pain is often taken less seriously, that their emotional expressions are more likely to be labeled dramatic or unstable. The ghost of hysteria still haunts the charts. It just wears newer language. You remember being told once that your panic attacks were probably hormonal. Another time, a therapist suggested you focus more on gratitude. You left both sessions feeling invisible, but now, with this new wave of support, you feel something different, seen. And when you speak in circles now, whether online or in person, you carry the weight of generations with you. The herbalists, the asylum patients, the writers, the protesters, the women who never got to say what you now can. You still have anxiety. That hasn't magically vanished. But the shame around it, that's fading. Now, when the spiral starts, when your chest tightens and the thoughts loop and the world feels loud, you don't assume you're broken. You assume you're responding to pressure, to grief, to unmet needs and unspoken stories. And instead of hiding it, you name it. You tell your friend, today's a heavy day. She doesn't say, you'll be fine. She says, I get it. Want to sit in silence together? And that's the medicine. Not the cure, not the fix, but the space. The space to feel everything without apology. The space to remember that anxiety in all its shaking, twisting, spiraling mess is not something to fear. It's something to understand. And that understanding, that's a revolution all its own. You're sitting at a polished wooden desk, and in front of you lies a thick book. Its spine creased, and its title printed in clinical gray. Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM. This is psychiatry's Bible, its catalog of human minds gone off script. A manual designed to classify, label, and, ideally, treat every flicker of psychological unrest. You flip through the pages slowly, scanning the diagnostic criteria: generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, somatic symptom disorder. And something about the way they reduce life's messiness to numbered codes makes you uneasy. Here inside this book, your feelings are no longer seen as divine punishments, demonic possessions, or signs of wayward wombs. Now they're data, measured, compared, categorized. This is modern mental health. And while it's an improvement in many ways, the story isn't as clean as the pages make it look. A mainstream historical fact, the DSM, first published in 1952, was an attempt to standardize psychiatric diagnoses across the United States. Over the decades, it has grown enormously, with each new edition reshaping the way disorders are defined, treated, and even perceived. What counts as a disorder changes with culture. Homosexuality, for example, was listed as a mental illness in early editions and only removed in 1973. That should tell you something. You look up from the book and glance at the posters on the walls of the modern clinic you're in. Diagrams of brains, flowcharts of emotions, smiling models promoting cognitive behavioral therapy. The receptionist offered you peppermint tea. The therapist's chair is ergonomic. Everything feels organized, optimized, professional. So why do you still feel like something's missing? Because beneath the fluorescent lights and electronic health records, some of the same old patterns remain. Women still are more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety disorders than men. Women are more likely to be prescribed medication, more likely to be told they're too sensitive, more likely to have their physical symptoms dismissed as psychological. The language has changed, but the lens remains tinted. You remember telling a doctor once that your anxiety made your chest feel like it was imploding. You couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate. His response? You're probably just stressed. Try yoga. The official term for that? Diagnostic overshadowing. A known bias where physical or serious symptoms in women are written off as emotional overreactions. It's been documented, studied, and still, it happens every day. One open scholarly debate: whether the DSM itself carries embedded gender bias. Critics point out that some diagnoses reflect cultural norms more than objective science. For example, borderline personality disorder, a diagnosis disproportionately given to women, is often described using language that overlaps with stereotypical ideas of female emotional instability. But what if the traits being pathologized, sensitivity, emotional expression, relational distress, aren't symptoms of mental illness, but rather symptoms of living in a society that constantly demands women suppress themselves? You sit in therapy, and this time the practitioner is a woman. She doesn't interrupt, she doesn't minimize. She asks questions that make space instead of closing doors. How long have you felt this way? What happens in your body when the anxiety comes? What were you taught to believe about your feelings? And for the first time in a long time, you don't feel like a case study. You feel like a person. This is the best of modern mental health care, where diagnosis becomes a tool, not a verdict, where labels help access resources, not define your identity, where anxiety is understood not just as a chemical imbalance or neurological blip, but also as a rational reaction to real-life conditions, economic stress, trauma, gender roles, systemic injustice. But it's still a work in progress. You've read stories, recent ones, of women being misdiagnosed for years, of chronic illnesses mistaken for somatic anxiety, of women begging to be heard only to be told to calm down or give it time. You know the history. You see its fingerprints on every prescription pad, one fringe but telling detail. The phrase diagnostic creep has been used to describe how the boundaries of mental illness expand over time, turning more and more human experiences into clinical conditions. Are you nervous about the future? Sad after a breakup? Dissatisfied with your job? The modern DSM might have a code for that. It's a double-edged sword. More people get help, but more people also get labeled, and women especially are caught in that tangle. You look around at your friends, so many of them on SSRIs or mood stabilizers. Some say it helps, others feel muted, some can't afford consistent care. Others get stuck in endless loops of referrals, forms, and insurance denials. Mental health is no longer taboo, but it's also a business. And anxiety? It's become a buzzword, something that gets slapped on t-shirts and coffee mugs. Anxious, but cute. Too blessed to be stressed. It's just my anxiety talking. The humor helps. The openness matters. But sometimes it feels like the seriousness has been flattened. Because beneath the slogans are women who still wake up every morning with their hearts in their throats, who go to work despite the panic, who raise children while secretly spiraling, who manage households and relationships and aging parents and medical conditions while barely holding it together, and they're told they're doing just fine. You close the DSM and realize something important. You don't need a label to tell you you're hurting, but sometimes it helps. Sometimes knowing that your symptoms are real, named, and shared by others is the first step toward healing. Other times it's not a diagnosis you need. It's permission to feel what you feel. To be anxious in a world that gives you every reason to be, to stop performing calmness for the comfort of others, to speak without having to sanitize, to cry without having to apologize. And slowly you begin to unlearn. You unlearn that silence is safer than honesty. You unlearn that stability means always being pleasant. You unlearn that anxiety is a flaw. Because maybe it's not. Maybe anxiety is just your nervous system trying to protect you, trying to warn you, trying to say, this is too much when no one else will. You leave the clinic that day without a new diagnosis, but with something better. A voice that feels a little louder, a heart that feels a little softer, and a quiet, steady thought repeating in your head. It's not all in your mind. It's in your body. It's in your story. It's in your history. And you're finally beginning to understand it. You're on your couch now. Your own couch, finally, with a weighted blanket pulled up to your chest, and the faint blue glow of your phone lighting up your face. You've just scrolled past your third anxiety meme in the past 5 minutes, and it's hard to tell whether you're laughing or just breathing out too hard. It reads, "Me, I'm fine. Also me. Google's, can stress actually kill you?" You double tap. Heart emoji. Keep scrolling. Welcome to the 21st century, where anxiety is everywhere and nowhere all at once. It's a clinical term. It's a trending hashtag. It's a punchline, a diagnosis, a lifestyle, and sometimes a badge of honor. You live in the age of therapy culture and self-care industrialism, where women's emotional lives are finally being talked about, openly, globally, loudly, but also constantly mined, marketed, and monetized. You pull your hoodie tighter around your shoulders and stare at the bottle of SSRIs on your table. They help. Some days, other days not so much, but at least now no one tries to shame you for needing them. That's new. There's a podcast playing in the background. A soft-spoken woman with a clinical license and a warm voice is talking about boundaries. You like her. She reminds you to drink water, to take breaks, to forgive yourself. She ends the episode with a breathwork exercise. You promise you'll do it later. You won't. One mainstream fact. Anxiety is the most common mental health disorder in the world, and women are nearly twice as likely to be diagnosed as men. The reasons are layered: biological, social, cultural, hormonal fluctuations, caregiving roles, the mental load, the pressure to perform constant emotional labor with a smile, the centuries of legacy trauma baked into your bones. But now, for the first time in history, women are allowed to talk about it out loud. You remember when it felt like a secret, when saying you had panic attacks meant people would flinch. Now it's in book titles, in celebrity interviews, in Instagram captions, and YouTube confessions. You hear your favorite pop star say, "I have anxiety," and suddenly you don't feel so alone. But even openness has its complications, because when everything is anxious, when the culture itself is overwhelmed, how do you know what's yours and what's the world's? You get invited to a wellness seminar. The flyer promises transformation. The ticket price promises bankruptcy. It includes yoga, journaling, trauma-informed breathwork, moon circles, sound baths, and an anxiety release crystal set. You laugh because it's ridiculous. Then you cry because you want it anyway. You want something, anything to help. Make the fear stop buzzing in your chest at 3 a.m. But here's the thing. While the tools are modern, the message hasn't changed much. You're still being told the problem is you. Your nervous system is overreactive. Your cortisol levels are too high. You're too plugged in. You're not meditating hard enough. You've skipped your affirmations. You didn't journal with gratitude. Maybe your screen time is the issue. Maybe it's gluten. Maybe you just need better magnesium. You take a deep breath and wonder if this is just another polished version of the same old narrative. You're not doing womanhood right, and your anxiety is the proof. Because now, instead of wandering wombs and rest cures, you get Instagram ads for weighted sleep masks and 10-step morning routines that promise to cure your inner chaos. Self-care is supposed to help, but sometimes it feels like another chore. One fringe detail: the global self-care market is now worth over $1.5 trillion. That includes apps, supplements, retreats, courses, and skincare lines marketed explicitly to women with phrases like "nourish your nervous system" and "cleanse emotional toxicity." And while some of it is genuinely helpful, some of it feels suspiciously like a rebrand of the same systems that once called you hysterical. Only now they offer you a candle instead of a diagnosis. You turn off your phone for a moment and let the quiet fill the room. You try to count your breaths, to let your thoughts settle. But your thoughts don't settle. They just pace. You're not alone in this. Your friends, smart, funny, creative women, are also medicated, also in therapy, also juggling 20 invisible jobs, while fighting the urge to scream into the void. You text one of them, "Is it just me, or is the world too loud today?" She responds, "It's not just you." That sentence is more effective than the last 5 meditations you listened to. Because now you know what generations before you didn't. You're not broken. You're overstimulated. You're expected to be emotionally available to everyone. Your boss, your kids, your partner, your group chat, while also being chill, hydrated, flexible, sexy, well-rested, productive, politically engaged, spiritually awake, and not too loud about any of it. Of course you're anxious. Who wouldn't be? One open scholarly debate centers around whether today's rise in anxiety diagnoses is due to increased awareness or increasing pressure. Some argue that we finally created space for women to name their pain. Others say we've simply created a world that makes that pain inevitable. You walk through your apartment, past the pile of laundry you meant to fold, past the journal you abandoned halfway through a 30 days of mindfulness challenge. You're not failing at healing. You're just tired. And tiredness is not a flaw. It's a fact. You make tea and sit down again. The podcast host is still talking. Something about radical rest. You let the words wash over you. You think about the women who came before, the ones who were burned, bled, silenced, medicated, shocked, dismissed. The ones who turned their fear into questions, who turned their questions into essays, who turned their essays into revolutions. You are their result. And your anxiety, it's not shameful. It's proof that you feel, that you care, that you're awake to the contradictions of a world that expects you to carry it without complaint. You may still have panic attacks. You may still take meds. You may still lose sleep worrying about your kids, your future, your own beating heart. But now, you do it with context. You do it with knowledge. You do it with language they never gave your grandmothers. You do it with a playlist of soft piano music and a group chat full of women who text back, saying, "That's not failure, that's survival." And tomorrow, when the fear comes again, because it will, you'll meet it not with shame, but with a little more softness, a little more patience, a little more truth. Because now you know anxiety isn't the opposite of strength. Sometimes it is strength. The strength to feel, to endure, to question, to heal, even when you don't know how. It's late. The kind of late where everything is hushed and slow, even the street outside your window. You're sitting cross-legged on your bed, the sheets tangled around your ankles, a soft light glowing on your nightstand, and the room feels like it's finally taken a breath with you. You're not scrolling, you're not listening, you're just being, and it hits you. For the first time in a long time, you're not trying to fix anything. You're not reaching for a solution. You're simply allowing yourself to be a person who feels deeply. A person who, after all these years, all this history, finally understands that being anxious doesn't make you less. It makes you human. You close your eyes and think back, not just to your own life, but to the long, ragged thread of lives behind you. The Egyptian woman fed foul-smelling herbs by a priest who thought her uterus had wandered into her lungs. The medieval healer whispering spells while clutching rosemary and praying not to be accused of witchcraft. The noble woman confined to bed rest, forbidden to read or move, slowly unraveling beneath the weight of enforced stillness. The young mother sedated into silence because no one believed childbirth could break a mind as much as a body. The writer shocked into forgetting her own name in a white hospital room. The housewife smiling for the Valium ad, her shaking hands carefully cropped from the photo. The teenager handed a prescription after saying, "I don't feel like myself." The millennial woman posting a meme because it's easier than crying in front of people. They're all part of you, and you are part of them. This right now is what healing looks like. Not glamorous, not sudden, not the neat arc of a wellness commercial, but real, unsteady, quiet. Something that trembles and aches and still continues anyway. One mainstream historical fact to hold on to tonight: mental health care has never been easy. It has evolved unevenly, pushed forward by a few, pulled backward by many. Progress didn't arrive gently. It was demanded, often in whispers before it became shouts. And yet, here you are, with access to therapy, yes. With the right to speak your mind without being institutionalized, at least most of the time. With medication that actually helps sometimes. With the words to say, "I am struggling," without someone trying to drown your voice in shame. It's not perfect, it's not fixed. But it's different, and that difference was built by generations of women who dared to insist that their anxiety wasn't a sin, or a disorder, or a curse. It was their truth. You remember suddenly something your grandmother once said. Quietly, like a secret she was only just brave enough to speak aloud. "I used to lie in bed at night and feel like the ceiling was pressing down on me. I never told anyone." You wish you could go back and tell her she wasn't alone, that it wasn't her fault, that she wasn't weak, that her silence wasn't her shame, it was her survival. And now? Now you get to break that silence, gently, gradually, with words that weren't available to her, and with a voice she helped make possible, simply by enduring. You walk to the mirror, not to fix your hair or check your face, but to look into your own eyes. And for once, you don't critique. You don't flinch. You don't shrink. You just look, and you say, I see you. Not as a diagnosis, not as a file in a drawer, not as a project to be solved, but as a woman, a whole one who cries sometimes without explanation, who wakes up with fear and still gets out of bed, who says no when it's hard, who says yes when it's terrifying, who laughs loudly and inappropriately, even when she feels like breaking, who lives. That's the quiet revolution, not the protests or the publications, though those mattered, but the small daily acts of being honest, of saying I'm not okay today and letting that be enough, of asking for help without apologizing, of learning that anxiety doesn't need to be conquered, it just needs to be understood. You return to bed. The night presses in softly. Your body, this miracle of nerves and breath and memory, sinks into the mattress, and you think, I am still anxious, but I'm not alone. You are surrounded by history, by stories, by millions of women who get it, who have been through it, who are still going through it. You are part of a lineage of women who were never allowed to rest, and yet still found a way to soften the noise inside. And now, here, you let yourself do what they were often denied. You rest. Not as a failure, not as surrender, but as a radical act of wholeness. You close your eyes. You don't fight the thoughts. You let them drift like leaves in a stream. You think of every time you were told to be quiet, and you whisper back, no. You think of every time you were told you were too much, and you smile, maybe I am. You think of every time you believed your feelings were the problem, and now you know they were the truth. And tonight, that truth can rest with you. The room is dim now. The noise of the day has long since faded into softness. Outside, the world moves gently. Cars pass in muffled tones. The wind rustles through leaves like a lullaby, and the distant hum of night insects creates a rhythm older than time. You shift under the blanket, its weight like an anchor holding you safely to the earth. Your breath slows, your thoughts untangle. Nothing is urgent, nothing is unfinished. Everything, for now, is enough. The story you've heard tonight may have felt heavy at times, layered with centuries of misunderstanding, pain, and struggle. But beneath all that weight was something stronger: endurance. Women endured, women adapted, women passed their quiet strength down like a thread through generations. And now you carry it too. You are not alone in your anxiety, not in your fear, not in your overthinking. Your shaking hands, your racing heart. You are part of something vast, ancient, and brave, and in this moment you are safe. There is no test to pass, no calm you have to perform, just this breath and the next. Let them come slowly, let them carry you gently, let the silence wrap around you like soft wool. You've made it to the end of this journey tonight, and now you can let go. Let go of the labels, let go of the pressure, let go of the need to explain. You've done enough, you are enough, and everything you feel is allowed to be here. So rest now, close your eyes, let the story fall away, let sleep find you. You're safe, you're home.